The smell of burnt rubber always makes me sick. But it was the font on that term paper that finally broke me. It was my student, Maya. She sat in the front row every Tuesday, smiling, while she typed out a 3,000-word confession for a murder I committed in 2014. A hit and run no one else could possibly know about. I tried to bury it. But 10 minutes ago, I found a black burner phone in my driveway. The last outgoing call wasn't to a blackmailer or a hitman. It was to my wife, Claire. Right now, I'm watching a live feed on my laptop. Maya is sitting in my kitchen, pouring tea for my 6-year-old daughter. My little girl is playing with a dented chrome car emblem. The piece of evidence I thought I'd melted down a decade ago. If I don't sign Maya's recommendation for the DA's office by midnight, that video goes to the police. But if I do sign it, I'm letting a monster into the heart of the law. Let me take you back to where this began. The radiator hissed, a rhythmic metallic wheeze that vibrated against the mahogany desk. Julian Sterling gripped the edges of Maya Vance's essay, his knuckles bleaching white against the heavy cream paper. On page 4, the ink blurred. Descriptions of a shattered amber turn signal and the specific trajectory of a black sedan sliced through the academic jargon. These details existed only in police archives and the nightmares he buried under a decade of tenure. His breath hitched. The scent of old parchment and stale coffee suddenly soured, replaced by the phantom odor of burnt rubber and wet asphalt. He traced a finger over the word fragmentation. His pulse throbbed in his fingertips, echoing the frantic beat in his chest. Across the hallway, a student's laughter erupted, sharp and abrasive, splintering the silence of the humanities wing. Julian shoved the paper into a drawer, the wood groaning as it slammed shut. The essay was more than a student submission. It was a forensic reconstruction of a rainy Tuesday in 2014. He remembered the way the guardrail in Ohio had curved inward like a broken rib, catching his headlight glare. He remembered the thud, a sound like a heavy bag of grain hitting the pavement, and the way he had simply kept driving, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The paper in his drawer mentioned the specific brand of cigarette found at the scene, a detail never released to the press. Cold sweat prickled his hairline. Someone knew. And that someone was sitting in his lecture hall every Monday morning. He smoothed his tie, his movements stiff and mechanical. He reached for the desk phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the registrar's extension. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a dry rattle in his throat. He needed Maya Vance in his office immediately. He told the assistant it concerned her future, a phrase that tasted like copper and ash. 10 minutes later, a soft rap sounded on the frosted glass. Maya stepped inside, her oversized thrift store coat dripping melted snow onto the Persian rug. She sat, her eyes wide and unblinking, flickering toward the closed drawer where her secrets lay hidden. "The scholarship committee expects original thought, Miss Vance," Julian said, his voice regaining its clinical, diagnostic edge. He leaned forward, casting a long shadow across her small frame. The office felt smaller, the walls pressing in. This essay ventures into dangerous, unfounded fantasies. It would be a tragedy if such reckless writing ruined a promising career. Maya didn't flinch. She tilted her head, a strand of damp hair clinging to her cheek. "Is it a fantasy, Professor? Or is it just a history you haven't graded yet?" Julian gripped his fountain pen until the plastic groaned. "Silence is a virtue in this department. I suggest you embrace it. If this paper leaves this room, I will ensure you never work in a legal capacity in this country. I have the weight of this university behind me. You are a girl with a counting habit and a scholarship I can revoke with a single phone call. He watched her, looking for a crack in her mask. Instead, she began to count under her breath. 1, 2, 3. Her voice was a rhythmic, haunting whisper. She was counting the books on his shelf, her eyes tracking the spines with predatory precision. The intimidation wasn't working. It was like trying to scare a ghost with a flashlight. The air in the office grew heavy, thick with the smell of industrial floor wax and the underlying rot of a decade-old secret. Julian felt the familiar phantom pain in his left shoulder, the one he'd injured during the swerve 10 years ago. He never turned left anymore. Every time he reached an intersection, he was paralyzed by the ghost of the man he'd left in a ditch. And now, this girl was bringing that ghost into his sanctuary. Suddenly, the door burst open. A man in a tan windbreaker, thick-necked and smelling of stale nicotine, marched in. He carried a heavy leather briefcase like a weapon. "Julian Sterling?" The man barked, his voice a gravelly roar. "You've been served." Julian stood, his chair screeching against the floorboards. "This is a private meeting. Get out." The man didn't move toward the desk with papers. He swung the briefcase. It caught Julian in the ribs, a dull, sickening thud that sent him reeling back against his filing cabinet. The attacker lunged again, his hands reaching for the drawer where the essay was hidden. Julian, fueled by a primal surge of self-preservation, threw his weight forward. He tackled the man, the scent of the stranger's sweat and cheap tobacco filling his lungs. They crashed into the mahogany desk, sending the leaking fountain pen flying. Julian's fingers found the man's throat, pushing back with a strength born of pure terror. He managed to shove the assailant toward the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. With a final, desperate heave, he ejected the man into the hallway and slammed the door, twisting the deadbolt. The lock clicked with a finality that made his knees weak. He turned back to the desk, his chest heaving. Maya was still sitting there, her expression unchanged, her unblinking eyes fixed on him. She hadn't moved a muscle during the struggle. Julian reached into the drawer and pulled out the essay. He needed to destroy it, to shred it into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces. But as he looked at the final page, his eyes caught a paragraph he hadn't reached before. The prose, the specific cadence, the use of words like structural integrity and perpendicularity. It wasn't just Maya's writing, it was his own. The sentences were lifted, word for word, from his unpublished doctoral thesis, a manuscript he kept locked in a fireproof safe in his basement at home. The realization hit him like a physical blow, a wave of nausea rolling through his gut. Maya Vance hadn't just researched the accident, she had been inside his house. She had walked his floors, breathed his air, and peeled back the layers of his private life while he slept. He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a student. He saw a predator who had already moved into his territory. "The 17th step," Maya whispered, her voice a melodic hum. "The 17th step in your house creaks when the humidity rises above 40%. It sounds like a bone snapping." Julian's world tilted. The sterile safety of his office was gone, replaced by the terrifying reality that his armor had been breached. He was no longer the expert on the criminal mind. He was the subject under the microscope. The following morning, the gray Ohio sky hung low over the campus, a leaden blanket that seemed to muffle the sounds of the waking university. Julian pulled into his reserved spot in the faculty lot, his hands still trembling slightly on the steering wheel. He had spent the night staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic thud-tock of the grandfather clock in his foyer, counting the seconds until dawn. As he stepped out of his sedan, a sharp, hissing sound reached his ears. He looked down. All 4 of his tires were shredded, the rubber sliced with surgical precision. The car sat slumped on its rims, a pathetic, grounded beast. Julian's heart hammered. He looked around the lot, but the morning fog swallowed everything more than 20 feet away. He stumbled toward the humanities building, his breath hitching in the cold air. When he reached his office, he found the door slightly ajar. The scent of spray paint, acrid and chemical, hit him before he even turned on the lights. Across his pristine mahogany desk, the word liar had been scorched into the wood with neon red paint. The letters were jagged, dripping like fresh wounds onto his ungraded exams. His books had been pulled from the shelves and stacked in the center of the room in sets of 3. Julian sank into his chair, his eyes stinging. This wasn't just a threat. It was a dismantling. Maya Vance was stripping away his prestige layer by layer. He felt a desperate need to strike back, to regain some semblance of control before the walls collapsed entirely. He knew he had to be smart. He was a forensic psychologist. He understood the mechanics of a frame. He waited until the hallways were quiet. Then he moved toward the student locker wing. He carried a stolen midterm exam in his pocket, a document he had taken from a colleague's desk. If he planted it in Maya's locker and discovered it, he could have her expelled for academic dishonesty. It was a simple, elegant solution. It was a right turn in a world of dangerous lefts. He reached locker 412. His fingers fumbled with the metal latch, the cold steel biting into his skin. He slipped the exam inside, the paper sliding through the slats with a soft rustle. He felt a brief surge of hope, a momentary relief. He was the expert. He was the one in control. He walked to the dean's office, rehearsing his lines. He would act the part of the concerned mentor, saddened by the discovery of a brilliant student's lapse in ethics. He smoothed his tie, adjusted his cufflinks so they were perfectly parallel, and knocked on Arthur Miller's door. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice steady and clinical as he stepped inside. "I'm afraid I have some troubling news regarding Miss Vance." Dean Miller looked up from his desk, his expression weary. He let out a long, heavy sigh. "Julian, I was just about to call you. Maya Vance was here 2 hours ago." Julian froze. "She was?" "She filed a formal harassment report," Arthur said, rubbing his temples. "She claims she's being stalked by someone on the faculty. She said her locker was tampered with this morning. She even brought photos of a man in a dark overcoat hovering near her cubicle. She seemed terrified, Julian. She's already contacted campus security to have her locker contents cataloged by an independent witness." The hope Julian had felt moments ago vanished, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. He had walked straight into a trap. By planting the exam, he hadn't framed her. He had provided the very evidence she needed to prove someone was targeting her. "She mentioned you, Julian," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "She said you've been acting unstable. That you threatened her in your office yesterday. That's preposterous." Julian snapped, but his voice lacked its usual authority. The air in the dean's office felt thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the room. "I hope so," Arthur said. "But until this is cleared up, I'm going to have to ask you to keep your distance from her. The board is very sensitive about student safety right now." Julian backed out of the office, his pulse thrumming in his ears. He had tried to play the game, and he had lost. He felt exposed, a man standing in a glass house while the stones started to fly. He spent the rest of the day in a state of hypervigilance, monitoring his own heart rate as if he were a patient in his own clinic. Every shadow in the hallway looked like a crouching figure. Every whisper sounded like his name. The university, once his fortress, now felt like a labyrinth designed for his undoing. As night fell, he made his way to the campus parking garage. The concrete structure was a cathedral of gray shadows and damp, subterranean chill. His breath misted in the air. He walked quickly, his footsteps echoing against the low ceiling. He reached for his keys, his fingers numb. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the roar of an engine. High-pitched and aggressive, the sound bounced off the concrete walls. Julian turned. A pair of headlights crested the ramp, blinding him. The tires screeched as a black sedan accelerated, the engine's whine rising to a scream. It was coming straight for him. Julian didn't think. He dove to the right, his body hitting the cold, oily floor of the garage. He rolled behind a thick concrete pillar just as the sedan roared past. The side mirror of the car clipped the pillar with a violent crack, sending shards of plastic flying. The vehicle didn't stop. It slammed into a row of parked cars further down the line, the sound of crumpling metal echoing like a gunshot through the empty garage. Julian lay on the ground, the scent of burnt rubber and exhaust filling his nostrils. His heart was a frantic animal in his chest. The sedan backed up, its tires smoking, and sped toward the exit, the roar of its engine fading into the distance. He waited for a long minute, his cheek pressed against the cold concrete, before he dared to move. His suit was ruined, stained with grease and grit. He stood up, his knees shaking. He walked toward the spot where the sedan had hit the parked cars. Shattered glass crunched under his shoes. Amidst the debris, a broken headlight lens, a strip of chrome, he saw something small and glowing. A cell phone. It lay face up on the asphalt, the screen cracked but still functioning. Julian picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a burner phone, cheap and plastic. He ducked behind a van, his eyes scanning the shadows, and began to scroll through the device. There were no names in the contact list, only numbers. He went to the recent calls. His breath caught. The most recent outgoing call, made only 5 minutes ago, was to his own home landline. A wave of nausea rolled over him. The attack in the garage wasn't just a threat, it was a coordinated strike. And the person behind the wheel was in direct contact with his family. He thought of his daughter, Sarah, eating her dinner in strict color order, and his wife, Claire, rewriting her mother's grocery list in the kitchen. He had to get home. He found a taxi outside the garage, his voice a raspy command as he gave his address. The drive was a blur of street lights and rain-slicked pavement. He refused to let the driver turn left, forcing a 10-minute detour through the suburbs. Every right turn felt like a desperate attempt to stay on the path, to keep the world from tilting into the abyss. When he reached his house, the lights were on, casting a warm, deceptive glow onto the manicured lawn. He burst through the front door, the grandfather clock in the foyer striking 9 with a heavy, mocking thud. "Claire!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the hollow house. He found her in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, a pen in her hand, the scratching of her nib against paper the only sound in the room. She was rewriting the grocery list. Bread, milk, eggs, apples. Her cursive was perfect, identical to the list her mother had carried the day she died. Julian slammed the burner phone onto the table. "Who are you talking to?" Claire didn't look up. She finished the word, apples, before laying the pen down. She let out a heavy, audible sigh, her shoulders slumped in their permanent arc of weariness. "You're late for dinner, Julian. Sarah already went to bed. She was worried about you." "The phone, Claire," Julian hissed, leaning over her. The scent of her lavender perfume, usually so comforting, now felt like a shroud. This phone called this house 5 minutes ago. Right after someone tried to kill me in the garage, Claire finally looked at him. Her eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth they had held when they first married. Maybe they were calling to see if you were still running, Julian. You've been running for 10 years. It must be exhausting. Julian stepped back, the world spinning. You know? I found the shirt, Julian. 10 years ago. The one with the blood and the grease from the undercarriage. I waited for you to tell me. I waited for a decade for my husband to be the man he pretends to be in his books. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. But you just kept adjusting your cufflinks. You just kept making right turns. Maya Vance, Julian whispered. How do you know her? She found me, Claire said. Or maybe I found her. It doesn't matter. She's the only one who isn't afraid of the truth in this house. Julian felt a primal sense of betrayal. His home, his sanctuary, had been a staging ground for his own destruction. His wife wasn't a victim of his lies. She was the architect of his exposure. I did it for us, Julian pleaded, his voice cracking. I did it to protect our life, our family. You did it for your tenure, Claire spat. You did it so you wouldn't have to look at your own reflection and see a coward. She walked past him, the scent of lavender lingering in the air like a funeral wreath. Julian stood alone in the kitchen, the burner phone a plastic tombstone on the table. He was trapped in a house of mirrors, and every image showed him the man he had tried so hard to bury. The next morning, the confrontation moved from the shadows of his home to the public stage of the university. Maya Vance cornered him in the central courtyard, the stone arches of the campus framing her like a judge. The air was crisp, the sound of student chatter a distant, dissonant hum. The district attorney's office is accepting internship applications, Maya said, her voice a calm, melodic hum. She held out a single sheet of paper. I need your recommendation, Professor. A glowing one. I want them to know I have the full support of the country's leading forensic mind. Julian looked at the paper. It was a golden ticket into the very system that would eventually prosecute him. And if I refuse? Then the police get the physical evidence, Maya said. She stepped closer, her unblinking eyes fixed on his. The chrome emblem from your 2014 sedan, the one you thought you disposed of in the ravine. It's amazing what a dedicated student can find with the right map. Julian felt the pressure mounting, a physical weight on his chest. He was being squeezed between his past and his future. You're a sociopath, Maya. You don't care about justice. You just want the power. I want the count to be even, Julian. 10 years of silence for 10 years of truth. Sign the paper. Julian took the pen, his fingers stiff. He signed his name, the ink a black stain on the white page. He felt a flicker of a plan, a desperate, final gamble. He had the burner phone. He had a lead. I'll get it to the registrar, he said, his voice flat. He didn't go to the registrar. He went to his car, the one with the new tires he'd had installed that morning, and opened a tracking app he'd surreptitiously installed on the burner phone before leaving the house. The phone's history showed a recurring signal from a location on the outskirts of town, a motel called the Blue Spruce. He drove there, his mind a whirlwind of structural metaphors. He needed to find the source of the leak. He needed to find the physical evidence before Maya could use it. The Blue Spruce was a derelict, rain-soaked ruin. The neon sign flickered with a dying buzz, and the air smelled of wet cedar and rot. Julian parked in the back, his heart pounding against his ribs. He followed the signal to room 114. The door was flimsy, the wood swollen from the damp. Julian took a breath, centered his weight, and kicked. The frame splintered with a satisfying crack. He burst inside, the scent of stale cigarettes and cheap bleach hitting him like a wall. He wasn't alone. A man, the same thick-necked process server from his office, lunged from behind the curtain. He swung a heavy metal flashlight, the beam a frantic, dizzying streak of light in the dim room. Julian ducked, the air from the swing whistling past his ear. He drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, the two of them crashing onto the stained mattress. They rolled onto the floor, a brutal, primal struggle in the cramped space. The man's knuckles popped, a loud, wet sound, as he rained blows down on Julian's ribs. Julian fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed. He wasn't a professor anymore. He was a man fighting for his life. He grabbed the flashlight from the floor and swung it with all his might. It connected with the man's temple with a sickening thud. The attacker slumped, his breathing heavy and ragged. Julian stood over him, his own breath coming in shallow gasps. He felt a surge of dominance, a dark, intoxicating thrill. He had won. He was still the hammer. He began to tear the room apart. He ripped the sheets from the bed, overturned the small table, and kicked in the bathroom door. He was looking for the chrome emblem, for the files, for anything he could use as leverage. He pulled back a heavy velvet curtain at the back of the room, expecting a window. Instead, he found a wall of monitors. 6 screens, glowing with a cold, blue light. Julian's heart stopped. The monitors were broadcasting a live, high-definition feed of his own home. He saw his living room, his daughter's bedroom, the kitchen where he had sat with Claire just last night. The cameras were hidden in the smoke detectors, the picture frames, the very walls of his sanctuary. He watched, paralyzed, as the front door of his house opened on the screen. Maya Vance walked in. She wasn't a burglar. She was a guest. She carried a small tray of tea. She sat down at the kitchen table across from Claire. His daughter, Sarah, ran into the frame and hugged Maya. The girl's small face lit up with a smile Julian hadn't seen in years. Julian fell to his knees. He was miles away, trapped in a rotting motel room, while the woman who wanted to destroy him was playing house with his family. The surveillance wasn't for blackmail. It was for total immersion. She had replaced him. 1, 2, 3. He heard Maya's voice through the monitor speakers. She was counting the sugar cubes she was dropping into Sarah's tea. 4, 5. The perfect number for a perfect afternoon. Julian let out a low, animalistic moan. He was completely trapped. If he called the police to report the intruder, he would have to explain the motel, the unconscious man on the floor, and eventually, the accident in Ohio. If he stayed silent, he was handing his children over to a predator. He stared at the screen, a single tear tracking through the grit on his face. The man of precision, the man of right angles and structural integrity, was finally utterly broken. The following hour was a blur of frantic motion. Julian left the motel, the rain drenching his suit, and drove toward a remote faculty cabin he owned in the deep woods of the Ohio Valley. It was a place of isolation, a structure of wet cedar and decaying forest floor. He called Maya's cell phone, his voice a flat, dead thing. "I have the documents," he said, "and the money. Meet me at the cabin. Alone, or the count ends today." He arrived at the cabin as the sun began to set, the trees pressing against the windows like a living wall. He sat at the small wooden table, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace resting across his knees. He was a man pushed to the edge of a second murder. He believed, in his desperate, fractured mind, that if he killed Maya Vance, the secret would die with her. He could fix the structure, He could make the edges flush again. The headlights of Maya's car cut through the gloom. She walked into the cabin, her unblinking eyes scanning the room. She didn't look afraid. She looked expectant. "You brought the iron," she said, her voice a melodic hum. "That makes one weapon. But I brought 3. Julian stood, the poker heavy in his hand. "This ends now, Maya. I'm not losing my family to a girl who counts stairs." He raised the iron, his muscles tensing for the strike. But as he looked at her, something shifted. He saw the way she was standing, perfectly still, her eyes fixed not on him, but on a small, blinking red light hidden in the rafters of the cabin. A camera. She wasn't here to be a victim. She was here to record a murder. The realization hit him like a bucket of ice water. He was a forensic psychologist. He knew the mechanics of intent. If he struck her, he was fulfilling the final chapter of her essay. He would be the killer she had profiled. He let the iron poker fall. It hit the floorboards with a heavy, hollow clatter. "You want a confession, Maya?" Julian said, his voice suddenly clear and resonant. He walked toward the camera, his face inches from the lens. "Then let's give the audience what they want." He began to speak. He didn't use academic jargon. He used the physical language of the truth. He described the rain in 2014. He described the sound of the impact, the way the steering wheel had vibrated in his hands, and the way he had watched the man's body disappear in his rearview mirror. But he didn't stop there. He described the extortion. He described the surveillance in his home, the threats against his children, and the way Maya Vance had systematically dismantled a man's life for her own twisted tally. He spoke for an hour, his voice never wavering, weaving the 2 crimes into a single, inseparable narrative. When he was finished, the silence in the cabin was absolute. "The count is at 0 now, Maya," Julian said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He didn't call a lawyer. He called the state police. "My name is Julian Sterling," he said, his voice a calm, metronomic pace. "I am at the Miller County faculty cabin. I am calling to surrender for a hit-and-run homicide committed in 2014. And I have evidence of a multi-year extortion plot I need to hand over." He sat back down at the table and waited.